Long lines in front of gas stations in Russia as the fuel has run out in certain regions, while there's talk from the Russian side about a potential river crossing over the Dnipro into Kherson to start an offensive there. But we'll talk about this as well as about anything else that has happened along the front lines and behind them in this SITREP about the war in Ukraine. United 24, a Ukrainian government aid organization, is collecting money for unmanned ground vehicles, for logistical support, for the evacuation of the wounded, and for mine clearing. In case you have some money to share and want to save lives, please hit the link in the description to make a donation. We'll talk about, first we start off with the situation in Russia. As you can see here on the Russian side, there are videos appearing of long lines of cars that wait in front of gas stations. We have numerous videos of this by now. According to reports, this is because of Ukrainian strikes against oil depots, against fuel depots, and against refineries. This should not be misread that Russia is going to run out of gasoline. Now, while this might be tempting to take this conclusion at this current moment, this probably more means that the logistical adjustments have not been made. These lines will likely not persist over the coming days and weeks or even months, but we'll have to see overall. But generally, it shows us what the Ukrainians can do with a more successful and more intense campaign against the Russian fuel industry. This shows that their not only logistics for the military will over time be endangered, but also the Russian population will itself start to feel the pressure. Then we have reports that the Druzhba pipeline is still out of order. So the Russian export over the Druzhba pipeline of crude oil is no longer working. A Russian Shahed also crossed 110 kilometers into Poland. It crashed there and exploded, but there was no property damage and no one was injured. We'll switch to the developments along the front line, and we start off in Sumy. Here in Sumy, we have a geolocation that the Russians have crossed here into Ukraine, into the town of Bezalivka. We have that geolocated here at this point. This is right east of Trotskoye, where the Ukrainians are likely still operating in this area here. So this is not necessarily a conclusion that Bezalivka is now under Russian control. We'll have to see how it turns out over the next coming days and weeks. That's it with the region of Sumy. We switch to Kharkiv, and here I do not have any changes along the front line, but we do have an interesting report from a Ukrainian officer in the place there. He says the Russians are being supplied with drones or by carriers, so soldiers that carry equipment, resupply, etc. for the frontline troops. Small units are advancing with anti-thermal coats. This is creating a lot of heat under these coats, so they have to take breaks frequently to cool down again. If they manage to gain forward enough, they gather at a position close to the Ukrainian frontline position to then start an attack. So basically, it's small troops that are advancing, that are gathering close to the intended target of the attack. And if they manage to create a bigger group, then they still try to attack with bigger groups. We see that the Russians adjust their tactics to the current needs, where bigger groups are easy targets, easy to spot. But at the same time, obviously, one of the military principles is the concentration of forces. So the Russians try to find a way to combine the need for as small groups as possible to be difficult to spot while having superiority in the target as well. While that is interesting in itself, especially in regarding to the change in tactics, this is it from the Kharkiv region. We also have nothing from this region up here, so we switch to the Eastern Front, and there is a geolocation out of eastern Kupiansk. We have a geolocation here that supposedly shows a Ukrainian tank hitting a building from very close proximity that would supposedly be occupied by the Russians. This would mean that the Russians have entered the eastern part of Kupiansk. As of now, first of all, the geolocation in my mind is questionable. I'm not convinced by this. And then secondly, I'm not sure from when that video is. And thirdly, if it is correct, if it is from now, then it might just be one of these small infiltration troops that are being now and then reported. So it's too early to spread panic that the eastern part of Kupiansk is suddenly being occupied by the Russians. We'll have to keep an eye on this. I'm not excluding the possibility that the Russians manage to enter Kupiansk again. Let's not forget they've been in there roughly half a year ago, but were cleared out again. So it might have happened again. But as of now, I'm voicing serious doubts. Further south, the Russians have advanced slightly inside of Ritkudup. Here we have the geolocation of the Russian on the western part. So this is now confirming here fresh Russian positions. Further south, the Russians have also advanced, and they have advanced into Saritsne. And we have a geolocation here of them in the southern part of Saritsne. So roughly at this point here, the Russians have managed to enter. Again, does not mean permanent control of them, but still a Russian advance. The Russians also managed to push the Ukrainians back in the Serebryansk forest. To which degree this was actually pushing the Ukrainians back or simply a Ukrainian withdrawal is unclear. As we've observed over the past weeks, the Russians have advanced south of the river Siversky Donetsk. They have likely taken the town of Serebryansk. Thus, for the Ukrainians, withdrawing towards the west is a sensible thing at this point to prevent the risk of being enveloped. So this might just be a Ukrainian withdrawal from further east. Still, though, the Russians have advanced there. Here again, from the area of Siversk, of Izium and Liman, we have reports by the Ukrainians that also the Russians are attacked with very small groups, but unlike the report from Kharkiv, here those small groups supposedly bypass Ukrainian positions and try to gather in the rear of the Ukrainian positions to then gain a foothold there. So we see that apparently different parts of the front line, different units try out and operate with different tactics to see what works in the current situation. Another thing we'll have to keep an eye on. South of the Siversky Donetsk, we have the Russians advancing into the eastern part of Vimka here. At this point, we have that geolocated as well, that the Russians are now at this point here. A small advance in this direction of roughly 1.5 kilometers in the upwards here. That's it from Siversk. We go to Konstantinivka, to the Konstantinivka region. Here we have the Russians entering the southeastern part of Oleksandro Shultyne. We have that geolocated here as well, that the Russians are now at this point. This is here on the map. So they have reached this southern part. Whether they manage to gain a foothold, again, as usually, is not clear. From the mine north of Turetsk, we have geolocation of Ukrainian strikes there, indicating that the Russians are still operating inside of the mine. In the last SITREP, we talked about the Russians shelling it with multiple launch rocket systems. Apparently, that would have been despite own troops still operating this. Obviously, this position here is of high importance to be able to keep the supply running for the Ukrainian position south of the reservoir. Further to the west, we have the Russians in a fresh position that is geolocated in Yablonivka. We have them here upwards at this position here, and this is here at this point, so a slight advance of the Russians inside of Yablonivka. In the Pokrovsk direction, we have the Russians northwest of the town of Poltavka. This is geolocated here at this point. When we go to these positions here, we have that the Russians are now at this point. So they managed to push somewhat towards the north here, and we see them operating in this direction as well. We have them here in west of Pankivka here. We have them further west of Pankivka, and we have them inside of Pankivka at the entrance of Volodymyrivka as well. So this is the Russians operating here and further west. And now at this point here, we see that the Russians seem to widen their breach into the Ukrainian front lines here, to widen the base towards the advance they had towards the north. They are still operating here in the south, whereas the Ukrainians managed to push out the Russians somewhere in the north. Then we have a video from Petrivka up here. This is the Russian soldiers being taken as prisoners of war. Here, close to this Petrivka up there. And we have them being bombed directly there as well, with a drone drop munition. So we have the Russians being taken prisoner here and being bombed here. In both cases, I'm not clear from when that is. No, the first one where they were taken prisoners is roughly a week old. So we have visual confirmation now that the Russians were actually operating up here. And this attack on a Russian position is unclear from which point. This might be from 2 days ago, indicating that there might still be small Russian troops further in the north here, or this might also be a week old at this point. We cannot really say, but we have visual confirmations that the Russians were able to cut the road between Dobropilya and Kramatorsk here in the past. Further south, the Russians have been pushed back in Rodivka. We have a geolocation of this as well. Here we have the Ukrainians operating south of the reservoir. This is at this point here. So we see that the Ukrainians have operated here, managing to push the Russians a little bit back in this direction. In the Dnipro direction, we have the Ukrainians showing their flags in Oleksandrograd. This is geolocated as well. Oleksandrograd was recently captured by the Russians, or at least they were showing their flags. So we now have visual confirmations of the Ukrainians being back inside of it, and we have the Russians in Novoherhivka, which is here, which is inside of Dnipro Oblast. There we have a visual confirmation of the Russians operating here. Whether or not they gain a foothold, again, as usually, is a different question. Unclear as of now, but it shows us that the Russians have once again entered Dnipro Oblast. Then we have something interesting from the Dnipro itself. We have a Russian mill blogger saying that right now they are flattening the eastern part of Kherson. This is to prepare a bridgehead and to basically cross over the river and take that area. He's voicing numerous announcements like this, but at that point we obviously have to say, is it likely that a Russian soldier, a Russian mill blogger, is openly announcing that they plan to cross the Dnipro weeks, at least days, probably weeks before it's actually happening? That's obviously something we have to question. We can just keep an eye on it, whether it's true. It seems unlikely that this is going to happen, but obviously the Ukrainians were able to gain a foothold on the other side of the river as well, in Krinky, and were able to supply it for several months, over half a year, I think, despite suffering heavy losses, so that the Russians might want to try out something like this on the other side of the river, especially now with negotiations happening, so they can claim we even crossed the river and will be able to advance further from here. Seems at least possible in this scenario. That's it with the territorial changes we have from the front line. Overall, the situation, as usually, hasn't overall changed. The Russians hold the strategic initiative. We have occasional Ukrainian successful counterattacks, but overall, the Russians slowly creep forward. The advance isn't very fast, and especially with the immediate danger north of Pokrovsk probably being addressed right now, the situation is a little less drastic as it was a couple of days ago, but overall the Ukrainians keep being pushed back. Then we have something interesting from opposition media. The Russian opposition media says that the recruitment has dropped massively according to the budget numbers. 2.5 times fewer recruits were recruited in the second quarter of 2025. Compared to 2024. Now, this would obviously be a great sign of the Russians running out of men soon, but the ISW is saying at the same time they think that it's just being financed over other budgets, and in fact we do not see any proof that the Russian troop numbers are being reduced despite the high losses, so Russian recruitment seems to clearly keep up with the losses as of now. The Russians are preparing for a longer war and for the future as well, with a massive training program for the Russian youth to make them acquainted, to acquaint them to drones and to be able to use them as future drone pilots, as the British Ministry of Defense is saying here. They plan to have 1 million pilots trained in 2030, and for that they are using the youth. Then we have in the political sphere some news. Trump apparently is willing to aid Western peacekeepers from the air with air cover. This is being reported from the US. We'll have to see in the end, obviously, what is going to happen there overall. But according to the reports, him and Zelensky are currently working on an exchange of all the prisoners of war from both sides. So basically an exchange all against all, as well as a return of the abducted Ukrainian children. According to media reports, Zelensky also offered to send a... According to media exports, Zelensky also offered to spend $100 billion US dollars on weapons bought from the United States. This would be financed by the Europeans. In exchange, he offered joint production of drones with the United States. To which degree, which weapons are being included in this, and how the US have reacted to this, or whether the US will agree to this, is too early to say at this point. But this should obviously be an attractive offer towards the United States. And there we see that Zelensky is not only prepared to buy weapons for his military, but also to give Trump something to tell his domestic audience that increasingly thinks, even among the Republicans, that Ukraine should be supported more than it is right now. Then we have the situation from the reality is hitting the current negotiations. The meeting between Zelensky and Putin that was announced by Trump is still more than just questionable. It's definitely not going to happen too fast. We have a Russian presidential aide, Ushakov, here saying that right now they are working to increase the importance of the representatives of both sides, but not a direct meeting between the two presidents. As said in the past, if Putin were to agree to meet Zelensky, he would acknowledge him as his equal. This would destroy the narrative of a Nazi government, because you wouldn't negotiate with a Nazi government. This would also acknowledge Ukraine as a sovereign state, because you would only meet with and negotiate with someone of your equal footing who represents a sovereign state. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, also said that the Russians were forced to intervene inside of Ukraine to protect themselves and the Russian-speaking Ukrainians. The Ukrainians basically had to be protected from their own government, and this means that it's not legitimate and has to be replaced. So we do not see in any way Russia being willing to reduce its demands. Security guarantees or NATO troops will also not be accepted, says the spokesperson for the foreign ministry. This is, again, should not be a surprise. We talked about it in length in the past here. NATO troops inside of Ukraine would basically be a NATO membership for Ukraine through the back door. If NATO is in Ukraine already and is being attacked there, and this leads to Article 5, then it would be a NATO protection for Ukraine that Russia does not want. And Russia wants to keep NATO away. It doesn't want the troops getting closer to it, to the current front line, so that Russia will actually be willing and able to accept NATO peacekeepers or peacekeepers from NATO nations inside of Ukraine is, as of now at least, highly unlikely. And that was it with today's SITREP. If you like this report, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description, and there you can also donate for the unmanned ground vehicles to aid reduce the risks for Ukrainians and to save Ukrainian lives. But that was it from my side. I hope to see you again. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back.